All right, I wanted to say first thanks to Anthony and to the library for having me out. I'm really excited to be here. I live here in the community, so getting to come here and speak is a big honor. I love the library, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm just going to start off and tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into writing, and a little bit about my journey. And if you have a question at any time, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me. That's fine. And then I'll probably be pausing begging for questions later when I run out of things to say. But I did start writing under my original name, on my real name, John Mantooth. I started writing when I was 30. Probably like a lot of you guys that are in the writing group, something I wanted to do my entire life. But my life was sort of getting away from me with high school. I was too immature. College, I was too immature to really ever sit down and do anything. And when I turned 30 years old, it was one of those moments where I kind of looked back, where am I? What do I want to do? And I realized, hey, whatever happened to that writing thing that I thought one day I'd be a published author? And I decided to give it a shot and made myself a goal that I wanted to publish a novel by the time I was 40, which 10 years, I thought, surely I can do that. It took me 11, so it was very difficult. But when I started off, I was not a good storyteller. I think I was maybe a decent writer, I don't know, but my storytelling was very, very bad. I didn't know how to tell a story, and I immediately jumped into writing novels. I think that's what a lot of people do because that's what most people read. They read novels. They don't read very many short stories. And I think I wrote my first novel, maybe it took me about a year to write it, and I tried immediately to send it to some publishers. Never heard back from any of them. And I mean, now I can look back and see that it was just a really bad novel. But I didn't give up, and I tried again, and I thought, well, I'll try a young adult novel because that was kind of hot at the time, and I was reading some young adult novels, and this one was probably just as bad. And I did get a response from one agent on that one, and it was not a good response. She told me that she just found herself reading the words sometimes and like asking herself, what does that even mean? I mean, it was really harsh, and it hurt me a little bit. But that was when I decided I needed to take a step back and try something different because I knew I still wanted to do this. I'd kind of caught the bug by then. I enjoyed writing. I enjoyed, the time of sitting down at the keyboard and writing something, but I just wasn't having success with the novel. So I ended up joining an online writing community called Zoetrope. I think it might still be around. I don't know. It was a lot more popular, I know, back in the early 2000s. And at Zoetrope, you can submit a short story and have other writers critique it for you. And it's all online, and then you do the same for them. And so I was like, well, I need to write a short story. So I wrote a short story, and I got some positive feedback on it, and it made me feel good. So I was like, I'm going to try this short story thing. And before long, I had written a bunch of short stories, and I was seeing the advantage in short stories because it lets you practice telling a story. With a novel, a lot of times, you've probably had this experience. You start a novel, and you're real excited about it, and then you get in maybe 15,000 words, 20,000 words, and you're suddenly losing the thread a little bit, and you're not as excited anymore, and so you quit and you start something else. That's a big problem that I had, but when I started writing short stories, I was able to work on a beginning, a middle, and an end, and really learn how to tell the whole story. So I had I started to get a little bit of success. It's not anything great, but for me it was. I got published in a few places. I even got paid a few times. And before I knew it, I had a bunch of stories that had been out there. And I approached Cheezine, the publisher. It's a Canadian publisher. And they do tend to sort of specialize in some darker fiction, but that was right where my stuff was. And the weird thing is about Cheezine is they used to have an online magazine, and I had submitted my stories to them over the years and always gotten rejected. And I submitted a manuscript to their print publishing company, and they accepted it. And it was the same stories they had rejected for their online magazine. But what I found out was that there's a husband and wife team. The husband had been reading my stories for the online magazine, and the wife read the stories for the print. and she loved my stuff. So that was pretty cool. So at this point, that was 2012. I decided that it was time to try out my hand at a novel again, and I did, and it was a lot easier. It still wasn't easy. Novels to me are the hardest thing to write. I would rather write a short story any day, but I was able to kind of get through one, and I think it was decent enough to where I felt good about sending it out. I queried about 75 agents and got some responses from some. Some wanted to read some of the manuscript. Some liked what they read, which was a real big bonus. But I still wasn't getting any real bites until I was actually, come to think of it, I think I was here one day when I got a email from an agent in New York and said she wanted to talk on the phone. And so I was thinking, wow, this is pretty good. And I got home that afternoon, or maybe it was the next afternoon when we set up the call, and we immediately had this issue of understanding each other because she was from New York and I was from Alabama. And I don't think she'd met a lot of people, believe it or not, from Alabama. And I hadn't met a lot of New Yorkers at this point in my life. So we spent about the first 5 minutes just getting used to each other's accents and understanding each other. But she ended up wanting to represent the book, and she said she saw some potential in it. And that was sort of the key thing because it was a lot of potential at that point. And we went to work on it at that then. And that was the first time I really had what I would consider an editor. Even though she was an agent, she did the work of an editor for me, and she really went through it, made notes on it, and we went back and forth, and I rewrote it probably 2 or 3 times over the course of about 8 months. And then we decided it was ready, and she started submitting it. And eventually we got a good response from Berkeley, and I was really, really nervous when I had to speak to that editor for the first time because Berkeley is an imprint of Penguin, which to me was like the ultimate in publishing. And, you know, in my mind then, I thought, if I get published by Penguin, I'm going to be famous. That's not true. And, you know, but it was a huge deal to me. And I had a call set up with the editor, and I still didn't know if she was going to buy it yet or not. She wanted to talk to me. I think they do that sometimes to make sure you're not crazy before they start investing a lot of time with you. I really do believe that because I always want to talk on the phone first and just sort of make sure. But I went to, I was so nervous about the call that I went to a restaurant. It was actually Full Moon Barbecue at about 4 in the afternoon when we set the call up, and I was the only person in there. But as soon as she answered the phone, I relaxed because she was more nervous than I was because I found out she was extremely young. I mean, like maybe early 20s. This was her first book. She was nervous to talk to me too. So we got over our nervousness and we hit it off, and she had a vision for the book that was a little different than mine, but not too much so. And we worked it out, and she ended up buying the book. And so the bad part about this story is that right after we sold the book, my agent, who was my only New York contact at this point besides my editor, and she was new too, my agent retired. I don't know, she was like, I'm done. She just wanted to do something different with her life, and I mean, she retired, and she said, I'll find you another agent. Well, it didn't really work like that, and it took me, this was a bad time, I guess, in my writing career because the book didn't do well. It was called The Year of the Storm. Despite, having the big publisher, it kind of got lost in the shuffle. I didn't have an agent to talk to about it. I didn't know what was going on, except for nobody was buying my book. And I did finally find another agent, I think in 2015, and that's my current agent. His name's Alex Shane, and he revealed a lot to me of some of the inside stuff that I didn't know. And I'm not trying to say that my book should have done great or anything, but he there was a lot of things going on with Penguin at that time, and he told me that a lot of books slipped through the cracks, and mine was not the only one that got absolutely no push from the publisher and nobody knew about. But bad luck for me because now nobody wanted to buy my second book. I had a second book written, and Alex liked it, and he was going to say he was going to sell it for me, but we couldn't sell it. We went to publisher after publisher, and they all rejected it. Some of them said good things about it, but it just, like I said, it was a low point for me. That was 2015, I think, when we were trying to sell that. And so I decided to write something new and brand new. I kind of moved away from what I'd done before, and I decided I came up with the idea for Earl Marcus, who is loosely based on an uncle I had. My grandmother was a really wonderful woman, just very much of a character, and she used to always tell my brother and I when we were being lazy, in her mind, which was pretty much all the time, she would say, "Oh, you're just like your Uncle Earl." And I had never met Uncle Earl, but his name was always coming up, and we were always just like Uncle Earl. And so before long, she said it so much, I kind of started to like the guy. I was like, well, dang, he can't be that bad. And so when I was thinking about the character, I decided to name him Earl after Uncle Earl. And then the Marcus is from the other side of my family, from my dad's side of the family. And both my parents grew up in North Georgia, which is where the books are set. But anyway, turns out Uncle Earl was a Korean War vet and had frostbite, and I think that was why he was lazy, because he had half his foot cut off. But anyway, that was my grandmother. So yeah, and then things changed with this book, and we started getting really good responses from publishers. But we were still getting one thing they were saying. They would just be upfront. They'd say it. The track record of the first book is not good. And this is a big mystery to me still in publishing, why they are always so concerned about your track record and your name. But eventually we found a publisher who said, we want to publish it, but we're going to have you take a pseudonym. Again, in my mind, these books would have done just as well under John Mantooth, but I agreed because I wanted the books to be published, and I believed in the books. So we started talking about pseudonyms, and they said, well, we won't, and again, you have to remember, this is a New York publisher, and they said, we want something Southern that's going to just be Southern when people see it, because my books they kind of have a Southern tilt to them. And so I went back through my family history, sort of like I did with Earl Marcus, the character, and I started thinking about names and real Southern names of relatives and that sort of thing, and I sent them a bunch. But every time they would be like, not quite sure about that one. Maybe we could go with something a little more Southern. It's like, eventually I gave up, and I said, why don't you guys tell me an idea? And it was like, I'd barely sent the email before I got a reply back, and they said Hank Early. I was like, that doesn't really sound much more Southern than the stuff I've brought up, but I'll go with it. And so they essentially came up with a pseudonym for me, and I took it because I was just sort of fed up at that point. But I've grown to like it. At first it was a little bit hard on my ears, but now I'm okay with it. So that kind of brings me up to the present day. These series of books have done better. The evidence is that it didn't just stop at one. I've got a third one coming out, and that's sort of how publishing works. If you got to do well enough to keep going. But the third one, I'm not sure if there's going to be a fourth one or not. My agent and I talked about it. I'm sort of burned out at the moment on Earl Marcus, and writers may understand this, that when you kind of write in the same world over and over again so much, I was just sort of ready to do something different. And against my agent's advice, I've decided I'm going to write a different book. I'm working on a different book right now because I just didn't see myself being able to do another Earl Marcus book right now. Not to say that I won't in the future. I'm sure I would want to come back to him at some point in the future, but I'm doing something that'll be more of a standalone right now. And my publisher, which is Crooked Lane, and I've been super pleased with them. They're a smaller independent publisher, but they're very much up and coming. And my experience with them has been so much better than it was with the big publisher. So take that for what it's worth. But they have the option on the next book, so hopefully it'll be something that they'll still be interested in. If not, we'll go somewhere else and try to sell it. So that's my story in a nutshell. I can certainly talk more, but does anybody have a question? Yeah. Yes, I did. There was one called Query Tracker. I think it's querytracker.net, maybe. There's a couple out there that I remember using, but the Query Tracker is the one that really helped me the most because it allowed you to narrow down agents who were actively looking for manuscripts in particular genres. And I actually found my first agent through Query Tracker because, like I said, I knew nobody. I was coming in cold, and that's to me probably the hardest part is getting a foot in the door with somebody willing to take a chance on your manuscript. The second agent, even though there was a little bit of a gap there and I struggled with it some, it should have been obvious to me because I'd actually met Alec at a conference while I was still agenting it before, and we'd hit it off. But for some reason, it never dawned on me to contact him after I lost my agent until like one day I was just like, why don't I query Alec Shane? We hit it off. He was interested in my books then, and immediately he was like, yes, definitely. And so it helps so much that the hardest part is getting that foot in the door, and then you can start, meeting people, making contacts, and it gets a little easier after that, I think. Any other questions? Or, yeah, do you have a question? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
What keeps you driving? Like, writing a novel takes a long time. What keeps you going? Do you ever want to give up?
Yeah, sometimes I do. And well, deadlines really help. The last two books, In the Valley of the Devil and Echoes of the Fall, I wrote under deadlines, and that was new to me, and that's a scary thing because they so you. I just can't explain it, the pressure it puts on under, at least it did for me. And Becky will tell you, my wife Becky's over here, she'll tell you with the second book, that's when I started taking blood pressure medication because I was having a difficult time getting that one finished. And that one was right up to the wire, and then I asked for an extension. So to answer that question, I like it when I could take my time a little bit more, like what I'm doing right now with this one. And maybe that was another reason not to do another Earl Marcus is I just was kind of tired of that pressure because they want the next one like soon, and I just had other ideas I wanted to explore, and that's probably more than anything that keeps me going is something else I want to explore, a different idea, something that gets me excited. And I think you have to be to do a novel. You've got to be excited about your idea, and it's got to be something that's got, for me, it's got to be able to surprise me a little bit as I'm working on it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should probably talk about that a little bit more because you guys are a writing group. The Zoetrope, I mentioned the online writing group was so big for me in the early days. And I had a group of friends that I'm still friends with now. Some of them are still writing, some of them are not. But we read everything that each other wrote. That was sort of the deal. It's like, of course, we were writing short stories then. None of us had moved on to novels. And I would stress that if you're really serious about this, and everybody's path's different, and some people are just brilliant and they can just knock out a novel just like that, but most people I know really have to learn the craft through shorter stuff, and we all read each other's stuff weekly on there, and it was huge. Now, as far as like paying an editor or something like that, I'm not a huge fan of that unless you're just really hard up for somebody to read your stuff. Because you can usually find a friend or another writer or something that'll give it a read for you, and it'd be probably just as good as an editor. I say that as somebody who who people pay sometimes to read their stuff. So, but anyway, I mean, it's just true. It's just true. I mean, I wouldn't spend a lot of money on that because I was talking to a guy the other day that's a writer, and he was saying, well, when do you get your editor? Do you get your publisher or your editor first? And they come together. Your publisher will provide you with an editor. So if you need something before then, I think you need to try to do beta reading or a critique workshop or what you guys have, with the Write Club. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Okay. For me, I think about My father was a reader, and going into his room, and this is sort of weird. I say his room. He and my mom later in life shared separate room. Not shared. They had separate rooms. Long story. But anyway, going into his room and seeing his bookshelf was just huge for me because I wanted to read everything on that bookshelf. And he read Stephen King. He read Dean Koontz. He read crime writers like Robert B. Parker, Ed McBain, Elmore Leonard. All that stuff was a huge influence on me. And the other side was that is I had found some stuff on my own by that time. I was reading Agatha Christie and Louis L'Amour, of all people. Those are two weird, separate, but I was a huge fan of both of those. And I gave those to my dad, and then he gave me the Stephen King and the Dean Koontz and that sort of thing. And I loved it. I mean, there was some of my fondest memories are reading in high school and middle school, and I hate to think had I grown up in today's world that I might have been a little bit more distracted by some of the things that are so distracting to teenagers. But back then I didn't have anything but a book to read. So, and I'll never regret that. I eventually, and I'm still a King fan. I still like all those authors. There's parts, that I don't like now, and I see some flaws in some writers. Like, to me, Stephen King can write a great book, and then he can turn around and write one that's just not that great. But I understand that a little bit better too from the author side. But one of my favorite, I guess the biggest influence on the Earl Marcus books, on the crime novels, has been James Lee Burke. He's probably become one of my favorites, and he's a guy I discovered a little bit later in life. He's writes about a Louisiana detective, Dave Robichaux, and he has a very sort of lyrical, very regional kind of style, and he's just an incredible writer, and he's still churning them out at maybe 80. He's getting up there. Yeah. So, but I read from just about all genres, really. I'm a big, when I was doing short stories, I would say reading Ray Bradbury was always a big influence on me because he was the master of the short story in a lot of ways. And anyway, yeah. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, that is, but I would argue that if they're not paying you up front, you don't need to do it. And I mean that's my take on it. I don't. She said, yeah, I was supposed to do that. I'm sorry. She said that when I say someone bought my book, am I meaning that they paid me up front for it? Yeah. So traditional publishing, you should expect to be paid an advance up front. And then that advance would be against royalties. So in other words, there would be money that would come to you up front, and then as the book sold, you would get a percentage of royalties, but you wouldn't start actually seeing that money until you earn out that advance. In other words, until you've made enough to earn that advance out. So they're just kind of paying you ahead of time on royalties they're expecting you to get. So yeah, that to me was the route to go. I think self-publishing is also a very viable route. It's not probably viable for me because I think the key that people miss on self-publishing sometimes is you have to be able to do it all. You have to be able to understand cover design, or either that or hire somebody. You do have to hire an editor then if you're doing self-publishing. You got to understand marketing and promotion. I am terrible at those things. I mean, like, really, I knew right away when I saw the people that were having success with self-publishing, and they had these big online platforms, and they're very much out there online, that was not going to be something that I was going to be able to do. I have tried it one time with not good results. My first book, The Year of the Storm, the one I talked about, I'm sorry, I'm not very good with this mic. The Year of the Storm that I talked about, it went out of print. It came out in 2013, and essentially when it goes out of print, your agent can negotiate the rights back to you. So he negotiated the rights back to me, And then I was able to make a new cover for it. I got one of my buddies to design a cover, which I like a lot better. And then the people at my agent's office helped me to design the inside, and we released it on Amazon as a self-published. But it's just kind of there because I don't know how to promote it very well. But if you want to go buy it, it's there for really cheap. It's like the Kindle copy is like $3.99. So does that help? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really hard. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. You do. Otherwise, it's just there and nobody knows about it. Yeah, I've experienced that for sure. And the publisher will only do so much, and some publishers will do more. That's one of the things I've liked about Crooked Lane is they've seemed to do a little bit more of a push. They do a lot of things with book clubs, so I get a lot of sales through book clubs. They also do a lot with libraries. They've made sure my books are in libraries all over the country, and even in some cases they're all over the world. And so those are sales. Those things help too. But you're right, and some people have a more of a gift for it than others do. I feel like every time I sort of try to advertise my book that I kind of feel a little bad afterwards. I don't know why, but I do. I feel like people are like, why is he doing that? So that's just my personality. Some people have a good personality and they know how to do it in like maybe a humorous way. I see friends of mine, I'm like, gosh, why didn't I think about making a post like that on Twitter that everybody thought was funny and they're going to go buy their book? But that's just, like I said, it's not my gift. I'm more interested in actually just writing the next book than I am advertising. But you got to do it to some extent, and events help. I mean, honestly, that's where I see a lot of sales is going and doing events and that sort of thing. And I will mention, since I don't see a question right now, I will mention an event here in Birmingham to try to self-promote a little bit that I would love to see some folks come out to. We're doing it's called Noir at the Bar, and noir is in like crime fiction, and it's at a coffee bar, actually, the Wild Roast, if any of you guys know where that is. It's coming up on November the 23rd, and we're going to have multiple writers there, including Robert McCammon, who's a local, probably the biggest writer I know in Birmingham. I think he lives in Vestavia now. He's going to be there reading, and we're all going to just read a little bit from our work. We've also got a guy, Nathan Ballingrud, who's got a Hulu series that's coming out based on his short story collection. So we're going to have a lot of good writers there, and we'll have books for sale. And, we do one every year. This is the third one I've done now in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. My writing process has changed a little bit over time. When I first started, and I recommend this until you really learn the ropes a little bit, I was very strict about I was going to do 1,000 words a day. Come hell or high water, I was going to do my 1,000 words a day. And that helped me a lot because it gave me discipline. But as I've gotten a little bit more into understanding how the process goes, it doesn't bother me so much if I miss a day because I know I'll eventually make it up. Weekends are huge for me. My buddy Kareem here, he's also a writer. Kareem and I met at O. Henry's Coffee Shop in Homewood because that's my favorite place to write on the weekends. And I like to get there early, but never quite as early as he does. But, that's huge. Like this morning I was able to do about 1,500 words, and that was not what I'd call a a good Saturday. Normally on a Saturday, I'd like to do about 2,500 words. But I had a lot of stuff going on this weekend too, and I was a little bit stressed about this event, so my mind wasn't where I wanted it to be. And then Sunday morning I try to do the same thing, and then during the week, because I'm a teacher, I try to just get it where I can. A lot of times I'll meet my daughter, who's a junior at Hoover High School. I'll meet her at a Starbucks after school, and she'll do her homework, and I'll try to write 1,000 words. So I don't do the 1,000 words a day, but I probably try to do about 5,000 to 7,000 a week. So essentially, I'm still getting that in, and then I take full advantage of holidays. Like we'll have a Thanksgiving break as a teacher coming up, and I might try to write 20,000 words over Thanksgiving. I mean, that'll be my goal. I don't know whether I'll reach it or not, but if I put a goal at 20,000, then maybe I can do 12,000, and it'll still be good. I do multiple drafts, and I'll come to you in just a sec. I do multiple drafts. Yeah, that's something I'm working on too, because I have a bad habit of, you guys have probably heard about the pantser-plotter dichotomy. I'm a pantser, and if you don't know what that means, it essentially means I don't like to plan a lot before I start. I like to get a sense of where the book's going and an idea, and just jump into it, because like I said earlier, I want to surprise myself. I get bored if I can't see some surprises down the road, if I can't get excited about the scene I'm writing. And to me, it's not as exciting when I know exactly what's going to happen in every scene. So because of that, though, I do find myself having to start over a lot. And that's generally what I do. I'll write 20,000 words, and I'll say, you know what? It's not quite where I want it yet. I don't really have the voice, or the setting's not what I want, or it's just not there, and I'll start over with what I learned from those 20,000 words. And then I might make it to 30 the next time, and then I'll start over. But I'm learning on each one of those drafts, and I'm implementing stuff, and I'm also cannibalizing some of those passages. The good ones I'll pull back into the next drafts. Okay. Yeah, and sometimes they do. I'm sorry. She said, do my characters pull me along in order to give me surprises? And I would say ideally, when things are going well, that's ideal. Sometimes I get pulled along too by a mood or a setting. Those are hugely important to me, because those are some of my favorite things as a reader, is the mood and setting of a book. So that's one of the things that I'm always going back and trying to tweak and make sure is there. And when I feel excited about the mood, the setting, and the language of a book, then the story seems to kind of do itself a little bit, if that makes any sense. But when I'm just worried about story, none of the other stuff comes along with it for me. And it's like, gosh, this is bland. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hard. She said, when you switch between point of view, which I have done before, what do you do to make sure the voices stay different? Probably not enough. One of the criticisms of my first book from Berkeley was that some people said they thought the voices were too similar, because I actually told that. It was a little ambitious for a first novel. I told that both were first person, but both were different characters. One was from a kid's, I guess, point of view, and one was from an older man's point of view, and they had kind of experienced the same events together, but they both had different takes on them. And a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people said as a criticism that they felt like the voices were too similar. It's hard to do, because you have sort of this natural writing voice, and but what I have done in the past is I usually just write it the way it comes out, and then I go back and I try to reread it and make changes as I go that kind of make it sound more like the other person's voice. That's a tough one, and honestly, you hit on probably one of the things I struggle with a lot, is trying to make those distinct voices. In the Echoes of the Fall, which is my book coming out on November 12th, all the Earl Marcuses up to that point have been told in first person from Earl Marcus's point of view. But there are some alternating sections in this one where I go to a third person point of view of one of the other main characters, and sort of tell his story because he's had a little bit of a backstory that's been somewhat of a mystery. So I think I pulled it off a little bit better this time, and it probably helped that one was in third person and one was in first person to make it a little easier for me. Yes. Mm-hmm. They tell you that it's not, but I did. Excuse me, and a lot of writers I know did too. Now, there's a lot of agents that will get on Twitter or whatever and say, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. You should," you know. I think the bottom line is they say that a lot, but they're really looking for an idea that's going to excite them. And so you need to have the most important thing you can do in your query letter is have something succinct about your book that they look at and say, "Oh, I could sell that." And that's really the key because they might look at it and say, "Oh, I'd like to read that, but I can't sell that." And they're not going to be interested in it. They have to see something that they think they can sell. Hmm? Right. Hmm. Um, well, there's no way I think that, and this is not going to surprise anybody, but I think there's no way to be a good writer without being a good reader first. As far as reading outside my genre, that's a tough one. I do enjoy some literary fiction, and I don't think my stuff would be considered literary fiction. Mine's definitely a little bit more genre, either crime, horror, that sort of thing. My short story collection was sort of all over the place, had a little fantasy and science fiction in there as well. Um, but to me, you know, not I don't want to sound like a cliche and like we don't need all these genre labels or whatever, but I mean, I'm gonna like it if it's just if it's a good story and good writing. That's gonna be something that's gonna draw me to it. So I tend to be drawn more to dark stuff for whatever reason, and that's not a very good answer to your question. I don't think. Hmm, what was it again? Yeah, I think it's hugely important. I could even make an argument for reading bad fiction, although I wouldn't waste a lot of time on that. But I've recently, oh, I shouldn't, should I say this? Um, I've recently read something that was not very good, but I read the whole thing. But I learned a lot from that because I learned as I see it. I think, John, sometimes you've done something a little bit like that too, that you're rolling your eyes at. And I think that can be really, really instructive when you're reading something and you're like, no, no, this is not working. And then you kind of hit that realization, I've done that before too. And and so you can definitely improve your own writing that way too. That's okay. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Well, as I've gotten older too, I found myself when I was younger, I almost kind of had a little bit of disdain for nonfiction. No good reason. I was just like, no, I just want fiction. I just want fiction. Bring me fiction. And now I've kind of gotten to where I find myself reading more nonfiction, and I found that informs because heck, it just helps you know more about the world. And to be a writer, you got to know some stuff about the world. You can't fake everything. I mean, I can fake a lot, but at some point, I got to know something because I can't fake it. So, hmm, yeah, that'd be a tough one. Yeah, yeah, Absolutely, yeah. Yes. Well, that was sort of up in the air. Somebody had said that they wanted me to, and I mean, I can do whatever. Do people? Okay. Okay. I see three people, so okay. Yeah. Okay. If there's time at the end, I will. I'll be glad to. Yes. Okay. Sure. It's up on in Bluff Park in Hoover. Yeah. November 23rd. I think it starts at 7. There's a Facebook. I don't know if all you guys are on Facebook, but there's a Facebook page for it. If you look up Noir at the Bar, it should come up. Birmingham. I advertise it on my Facebook. Again, I'm not. I'm struggle a little bit with social media because I always forget that I have a Facebook page that people can come and like, and that's probably the first place they come to when they look me up, and I just forget about that one. Question? Okay. It's called the Wild Roast. It's a coffee shop in Bluff Park. The Wild Roast, like coffee roast and wild. I think it's November 23rd, and it starts at 7 o'clock. And there'll be about 14 or 15 authors reading. Some are local, like me, and some are from. We have Emily Carpenter coming from Atlanta. Her books sell really well. You can buy tickets online. You do. I'm glad you said that because I always forget that. But they do. There's a $10 cover charge. Then but you can buy it online if you go to the Wild Roast. They've got all their events listed out. They do a really good job of having community events. Yeah, we'll see if we can pull that up and let you know. Thank you. Yeah, it's near there. Do you know where Burt's on the Bluff is or the Tip Top? It's right across the street from the Tip Top. It's where the old Moonlight on the Mountain used to be. I don't know if you know that one. Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, well, we've already mentioned you gotta keep reading because you can be super creative. Like I think about my son is super creative, but he's not really a reader, and he's not going to be a writer because of that. Because he's got imagination out of control, but you got to learn how to tell a story, and you got to understand the moves that writers make and sort of the language. But you can get that through reading, and that's the best education. And then I would start small. I you know I tell I teach middle school, so I have students ask me this sometimes, and I can kind of see their faces collapse a little bit when I tell them I don't think it's a good idea to start with a novel. I mean, writing a novel is better than writing nothing. Do it if that's what you really want to do. But again, small. Learn that their stories have to have beginning, middle, and end. Practice all parts of them. Practice your finding your voice, and then work up to something larger. And then get people to read your stuff. I met recently with somebody that is sort of a new writer, and he said, "Well, I've written all this stuff, but I don't know if it's any good." I'm like, "Well, you got to get somebody to read it. I mean, and try not to. You can start with your family, but try to find somebody that's not in your family to read it too. That might be a little bit more honest, or just so you can get a real appraisal of it."
I stepped out and think I missed part of something you were talking about that was of interest. Uh, How much of fiction do you consider is fact?
Probably, he said, "How much of my fiction do I consider as fact?" Probably very little in my novels. Some of my short stories were based really specifically on things that I went through or people that I knew. So those would be pretty factual with the names have been changed kind of thing. But there's probably always in everything I write, there's some probably model for a character here or there. Um, there's definitely my grandmother's sort of in the three Earl Marcus. Well, I'm sorry, really more just the first book. But her presence is kind of over the three Earl Marcus books, but not so much on any like factual events, but more like on just people that I've known that just were interesting to me. I try to pull like those kind of personalities into my characters. Okay, wildroastcafe.com. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Well, I was just going to you because I don't think I've heard from you yet. But either way, well, who wants to go first? It's the teacher in me. I think there's something to be said for emulation, especially when you're first starting out. But eventually, you're right. You have to try to develop your own voice. You have to learn to trust yourself. I would say that's probably one of the hardest things in writing is the first time that like maybe a writers group reads something and says, don't like this, and you're just like, no, actually, I think this is the way it's got to go. And I mean, that comes from experience, I think, and from more writing and from more confidence. The example I would give is in my old writing group, I had written a short story. Um, we were all trying to get published in this anthology, this big anthology that was coming out, and I put it on there for critique, and everybody in my writing group thought that the ending should have been different. But to me, that was my ending, and that was to me just that was the vision of the story. So I didn't buckle. And later we had the opportunity to talk to the editor of that anthology because our group used to host also like little chats online with editors and things, and we brought that up and because he ended up buying the story, and he said no, it was a good thing you didn't listen to him because that was what I liked about the story was the ending. So I think experience, persistence, and you got to have a little courage too because it's a little harder when you step out there and you're just like, this is me, this is my voice, and because people may not like it, but you gotta push forward anyway. To me, that's probably the biggest thing is you just got to trust yourself enough to do it. Um, I would say I have mostly in my short stories. Some of my short stories you might could say were more literary fiction. There's a couple that would be classified as creative nonfiction, whereas I mentioned they were based on real stuff, and I just sort of told the story, the real story, in a creative way. But how I decided on, I just write what interests me, and I've always, like I said earlier, I've always been a mood guy, setting guy, and like I like stories where the setting is very strong, and that's sort of it lends itself to the Southern Gothic, which a lot of people have said my stuff's sort of Southern Gothic in tone. I'm fascinated by the landscape, by the things that you see in the South and the way people are in the South. And I'm also drawn towards, I guess, a little bit the dark side. Those things are what interest me on a day-to-day basis. So that's going to come out in my writing. So since I guess the big change I've made, or the big purposeful change, was when I decided not to do something horror and I decided to do crime. But even my crime, there's those hints probably of horror. Some people told me in my first book they were surprised, like I felt like I was reading a horror novel. So anybody got any other questions? Well, my sister, um, I wrote a story one time where the main character was this kid. His name was Joe, and he had some problems. He had some issues, and that was part of his character. And afterwards, she came up to me and she said, "I really like the book and the stories in it, but did you really have to base that so blatantly on my son?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" She said, "The character Joe." I was like, it just dawned on me at that point that I had named him Joe, and her son is named Joe, and they actually had a lot in common. So, and it's like totally was subconscious, I think. And I was like, no, no, I didn't mean anything by that. You read that all wrong. But anyway, yes. Okay. I think you just I don't think you have to worry about that too much until you're done. And then I almost think other people are going to decide that for you. You write what you want to write and tell your story, and then people will decide, hey, this seems like fantasy to me. And if they could market it as fantasy or it seems like horror or whatever, that was one of the issues we had with The Year of the Storm is people weren't quite sure where to put it because to me it was a horror novel, but it also was a coming of age novel, and it also my editor thought it might appeal to some general fiction readers too, and so it was kind of just maybe too much going on there. But we worked on it together, and that was a time where I had to think about genre a little bit, and she was like, we have to push this in one direction or another. And so we worked to sort of push it. We actually pushed it more towards general fiction, but then the horror community ended up kind of picking up on it anyway, and it was more seen as a horror novel. So. Okay, I'm gonna need a book. Can you bring the Heaven's Crooked Finger? I'll read from that one. Thank you. Okay, so this was my first Earl Marcus book, and I'll just read to you the sort of the first part of the book. I'm not sure if it'll be the very first. Yeah, sure. What? Yeah, I'm going to read the first part. So before I start, this is one, when people read this book, almost inevitably people ask me, did you grow up in a church like this? And I didn't really, but my grandmother's church was similar to this in a lot of ways, minus the snakes. The snakes, you just want to make it more gripping, so you add stuff in, right? So my first realization that heaven, at least my father's version of it, didn't hold anything for me came 33 years ago when I was 17, on the day I picked up my first venomous snake with my bare hands in front of Daddy's church. It was a moment I'd imagined and dreaded since I could see over the church pew and watch my father stalking from the pulpit to the front row, wearing the church's old brown carpet thin, shouting so fervently with such conviction that I became certain I had to feel that conviction too. And if only I could, the world would fall into place and my father would love me once and for all. When I was a child and I watched him holding those serpents, I was sold. The words no longer mattered. It was a visceral thing, a tingle deep inside me, an itch, a fiery rash swelling across the hidden skin of my heart. It would drive me insane unless I scratched it. The year prior, I'd watched my older brother Lester shaking as he lifted the cottonmouth high over his head. Eventually he relaxed, even grinned, as the snake remained passive, its wickedness calmed by my brother's apparent faith. He was saved, a child of God, but maybe more important in the patriarchal world of North Georgia, he was a man of God. He changed. The distance that existed between him and my father diminished, and I was left alone, isolated with an odd mix of longing and dread. My father lived his entire life in preparation for his death, a North Georgia mountain preacher who believed in the almighty power of God and the strictest interpretations of good and evil. If he ever found a gray area in all his days, I wasn't privy to it. There was the Holy Scripture, and there was everything else. There was this world, and there was the next, and everything in this world was simply a test for the one that followed. If you passed the test, you made it to heaven in everlasting peace. If you failed even one of these tests and didn't get right with God, if you didn't fall on your hands and knees and ask for his forgiveness, you were damned to a hell worse than the one Dante described. In Daddy's hell, there was nothing but constant torture and excruciating pain. I remembered falling once as a small boy, cracking my chin open on the rusted edge of a shovel left carelessly on the ground by my older brother. Daddy picked me up and held me high like he always did, as if somehow trying to remind God that he worried for me, that he prayed for me daily, and that he'd yet to see any of the fruits of those ministrations. Feel that? He said, his voice a low and rough rumble that always sounded like the purr of a muscle car just before you really made the engine work. He only let his voice fly in front of his congregation, and then the low rumble stretched out sonorously, I can't say that word, over us and settled in the spaces between our thoughts and the ceiling of the little country church on the side of Ghost Creek Mountain, a comfort and a thread all tangled together. I nodded furiously at him. I felt it. That's hell, boy. Except hell's 1,000 times worse, and there won't be nobody to pick you up and dust you off and tell you it'll be better. It won't get better, not in hell. There's no end to it. Later, I would learn the steel blade of the shovel had connected with a bone, leaving the tiniest of cracks, enough to disrupt a growth plate and cause one side of my lower jaw to grow longer than the other, giving me an eternally crooked smile. When my turn to touch the snake came a few years later, I was a jaded teenager, probably already an alcoholic, my desperation for my father's love by then soured and replaced by a sharp and defiant hate. But maybe, I reckoned, power lay at the heart of that action after all, because didn't facing danger equal faith? And faith was the key I always lacked, the key that would unlock all doors, the one thing that would make me a part of my Father's world. In many ways, the opportunity to hold that snake in front of the church began to feel like my very last chance at salvation. On the morning I was supposed to take up the serpent, I vomited in the dank bathroom at the far end of the Church of the Holy Flame, wiped my mouth clean, glanced into a mirror smeared with dead insects, and promised myself I'd believe as hard as I had to and then some. I'd trust God completely, so he would seal the lips of the serpent, and instead of its venom, I'd be filled with the Holy Spirit, the secret wind I'd never known before. According to Daddy and all the men I knew, this had to happen soon, or it'd be a bad sign. I was sweating when the door to the inner sanctuary swung open, and I saw the throng already swaying to the sporadic thunking of Aunt Mary Lee's arthritic fingers on the tuneless piano. Daddy held two snakes, a large rattler he'd been using for years, and a smaller cottonmouth found years ago in some brush down near Ghost Creek. Stepping into the sanctuary, I believed I felt it, the wind. Daddy said it was a breath, and when it took hold of you, you might feel your feet lifted off the ground, your lungs expanding with fresh air of heaven. I waited, closing my eyes, willing it to come in. I'd always wanted to believe in something. I still do. I scanned the throng of congregants, looking for a kind face. I only saw two, my mother and Lester. Despite Lester's newfound closeness with Daddy, he always had time for me. We were only a year apart and were close in a way I truly miss now. I knew he'd been counting on this moment for a long time, hoping all would go well and that I would join him and Daddy as a man of God at last. My eyes also fell on Lester's girlfriend, Maggie Shaw. Maggie was the only girl who really mattered in our little community. She was in my grade in school, but because of her long blonde hair, quick smile, and womanly figure, she drew the attention of boys and men much older than she was. Even then, she was considered a threat to the godliness of male congregants, young and old alike, though she had not yet been vilified like she would be in the coming weeks. I spotted her in the congregation sitting with my mother and father, both founding members of a church. Sitting with my mother and father, both founding members of the church my father led. I knew they were deeply disappointed in her flirtatious ways and worked diligently to keep her away from the opposite sex, because nothing was more sacred for a young girl in the Holy Flame community than purity. It was just one more way in which I was deeply envious of my brother. Not only had he made the transition within the church, he was also spending time alone with Maggie. I didn't even try to imagine what they might be doing during that time. That would have driven me crazy. I know now I didn't love Maggie, but I wanted her with a power that can sometimes eclipse love. I often dreamed of escaping this place with her. We'd go to Chattanooga and live in sin, an idea I found at once both reprehensible and deeply compelling. In the weeks before holding the snake, I'd crept away when Lester did, but instead of following him to the churchyard, I went to Ghost Creek and lay thinking of her until my urges overcame me and I felt better, at least temporarily. Yet as much as I wanted Maggie, I realized I wanted something else even more. That itch, the one that ran across the skin of my heart, would not stop tormenting me. I had to scratch it. I had to make it stop. I craved Maggie, but I craved my daddy's love more. Aunt Mary Lee slowed the tempo, and Daddy began to speak. At first he only moaned, and I knew this was the spirit working its way through him like fingers kneading dough. Soon the moans took shape, and I heard words. Come and take us, God. Come and take us now. If your will, God, be for this serpent to strike, may he strike my son dead, just as Abraham presented his own to you, God. Just as he raised the weapon and you stayed his hand, I commend this boy unto your will, Lord, unto your perfect mercy, but even more so to your absolute justice. Then he closed his eyes, and the other words came out. These were the words that made my head spin, made me feel useless and afraid, because Daddy was gone, and what remained was some other alien thing, ancient and trembling beneath the ages. We had prayed the prayer of salvation so many times, but Daddy said you had to keep it at it until it stuck, until your doubt went away, and you felt the Spirit of the Lord take up residence in your heart. When that happened, he said, your sin would fly out of your mouth so fast you'd nearly choke on it. Once in the middle of a tornado, he made Lester and me go outside and kneel naked to the elements and repeat words after him. Sometimes he did it that way, feeding the words to us, but other times he wanted to hear them come from us, our own faith. That was what he always said. It can't be mine, boys. It has to be your own. Another time, when Mama had come home drunk, he'd slapped her and then pulled us into their room where he made us kneel beside him and pray and pray. It was for our salvation and his forgiveness. Mother lay on the kitchen floor, blissfully unaware of it all. At the time, she'd been 6 months pregnant with my little sister, Ada, who had only lived for a few hours. Daddy went on for some time. I closed my eyes and let the sounds float over me, hoping to catch even one of them and tuck it inside, hold it, feel it, and be filled. When the tongue ceased, he beckoned me. Mary Lee's pounding began again in earnest, and I wondered if she'd fall prone like she'd done before, legs wriggling, insect-like, as she landed on her back. As I approached, Daddy took the cottonmouth and kissed it on its head. His tongue flickered against my father's chin, and for a moment I believed I understood it all at last. The snake was a magnificent creature. To be so close to it, to feel its tongue against your flesh, must be a feeling of supernatural grace and power. I wanted that. When he held out the snake for me, I did not hesitate. I took it in my hands, feeling its otherness and the slick of skin, the cold languor in which it lay nearly dead in my palm. I turned it around so it would face me. I so wanted to be like my father, to please him, to find him where he was, wrapped in something so transcendent I would never want to leave. The eyes of the snake were flat, so flat I believed Daddy had given me a dead creature, and I almost dropped it. Later I would realize the eyes reminded me of my own when I looked in the mirror, that in many ways I was already dead inside when I touched that first snake. The serpent twisted in my hands, and I gripped it more tightly. The slack eyes found mine, and when they did, they held me in such contempt I knew everything was wrong, not just in me, but in all of us. The breath I was waiting for would not come, not like this, not now. I scanned the congregation, desperate for a friendly face. I found none. My mother had covered her eyes, and Lester looked at my feet, wincing. The cottonmouth opened its jaws and showed me the gleaming wet cotton inside its throat, and I began a journey past the fangs and into its belly. Years seemed to pass as I made my way through the cavern of its open mouth and into its hollow length. I believe a part of me is still trapped there, and maybe that's why I've never been able to quit drinking. It seemed like the only place to escape, the thoughts of hell, the sense that I'd never tap into the salvation Daddy wanted for me. So many times I had said the prayer, and each time it had never seemed good enough. I'd do something stupid or selfish or mean. I'd lash out in anger toward him. I'd been born with my father's temper, just not his faith, and this would cause him to quote scripture about discipline and how it was his fault. I'd not come to the Lord yet. Then he would begin to cry, nearly sobbing, as he made me hold the lowest limb of an oak tree in the side yard while he pulled my blue jeans around my ankles and tore the flesh off my ass with a switch as thick as cord rope. When the snake struck, I barely felt anything. I'd heard a venomous snake bite is one of the most painful injuries a person can suffer. I believed that, but for me it was only a prick before a veil fell over me and the room turned to shadow. All the people were gone. Not even my father remained. I dropped the serpent and fell to the floor. I lay there for a long time watching shadows. Most of the shadows were children, and after a while the realization dawned on me that the children were lost, trapped in a limbo so profound to this day I cannot bear thinking about it. When we were kids, Lester and I took to sneaking out of the long Sunday services in that hot and dusty church. We would slip down to Ghost Creek, so named because there was supposed to be a ghost of a girl who'd killed herself roaming its banks, still looking for whatever she'd not been able to find in her short life. I was fascinated by that nameless girl, that ghost I never saw, but felt more surely than any spirit my father wanted me to feel. No one seemed to know the details of her longing, so I imagined what they could be sitting on the bank, passing the bottle we'd stolen from local moonshiner Herschel Knott. I figured she wasn't really looking for anything physical. Why would a ghost, I reasoned, need anything of this world? No, I decided, it had to be escape she was looking for. Stuck between heaven and hell, that was her prison. She didn't care for either, and now she drifted along a creek because it was beautiful, because it was a promise she felt had been broken. That was what I'd come to feel too, betrayed, left in limbo between my father's angered God and the hope of another, better one. In some ways, everything that came after the snake bite was a shadow world, and I moved through it like a ghost, searching for a light to shine, for some tiny morsel or scrap that would help me believe the journey was worthwhile. When I woke 5 days later, I discovered Daddy had refused to take me to the hospital, and instead left it to God to decide my fate. And as he'd done so many times before, God had decided to torture me. He let me live. That's the first chapter. Sorry, that was a little longer than I remembered it. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for reading. It was very powerful, and it prompts a question. When
Okay.
you're editing like a draft, do you read it out loud, or do you read it to someone, or do you make a recording and listen to it back?
I do read it out loud, but no, I don't do recordings or anything. I usually kind of mumble it to myself at some point or another, and that usually comes later on for me when I'm just really looking for inconsistencies in the voice and that sort of thing. But I think that's a great idea to do. Thanks for reminding me, because that might be a good thing to do with the one I'm working on
I
now.
find you're a good reader, and I
Oh, thanks.
wonder if you use that method any.
I have in the past, yeah, but I tend to forget about it sometimes.
I want to thank John one more time for coming today and answering questions.